Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Thought Experiments in Civilization for Saturday, 25 January 2025. I can still remember the exact moment when I suddenly realized that there is no science of civilization. I was working on a presentation that I gave more than a dozen years ago in 2012, and while putting together one of my slides, it came to me quite suddenly. Ever since then, I've thought about the possibility of a science of civilization, what such a science could look like or should look like, and what it ought to tell us about civilization. I've looked for some conception of science, a science of civilization in the works of others as well. Once the realization dawned on me that there is no science of civilization, I realized that this must have dawned on others. And in the years since that realization, I've been seeking out every author, every book, and every paper I can find that either acknowledges the absence of a science of civilization or that tries to fill the gap. As it turns out, there have been a great many people who have thought about civilization in explicitly scientific terms, and many who have attempted to lay the foundations of its scientific study. But none of these efforts really took root. And by saying that none of them took root, what I mean is that others didn't take up their work in the same spirit, carrying it forward and critiquing, revising, elaborating, and extrapolating the model, which is what happens when a science becomes paradigmatic in the Kuhnian sense and is transformed into a scientific research program in the Lakatosian sense. So we have the idea of the possibility of a science of civilization and many tentative formulations that would like to be a science of civilization, but little more than this. Why hasn't more been done toward formulating a science of civilization? I think it's easy to be complacent about science in the early 21st century. It's easy to imagine that science has attained a condition of maturity, or at least an initial stage of maturity, from which stage it can continue on to further triumphs. The low-hanging fruit was harvested first of all, and now, according to a familiar narrative, we're mopping up what remains, and it's just a matter of time until we clean up the details and science itself is finished and, in a sense, exhausted. Since I had my realization about the absence of a science of civilization, it's been easier for me to recognize similar scientific ellipses in other contexts, and I've come to the view that science is episodic at best, and will never be exhausted. There are any number of under-theorized ideas, areas where science could be greatly expanded, and there are also large domains of human experience and activity that have never been scientifically organized into an explicit body of knowledge. For example, in addition to there being no science of civilization, there's also no science of technology, and perhaps most telling of all, perhaps most paradoxically and problematically, there is no science of science. The individual sciences are scientific, but the whole enterprise of science, there is no science for that. Once you get used to the idea of the incompleteness of science, you start to see it everywhere. I've just started on Geoffrey West's book, Scale, The Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economics, and Companies, in which he mentions the possibility of a science of cities and a science of companies. West wrote, quote, "It becomes a matter of some urgency to ask whether there can be a science of cities, and by extension, a science of companies. In other words, a conceptual framework for understanding their dynamics, growth, and evolution in a quantitatively predictable framework," unquote. I hadn't thought about the possibility of a science of companies before I encountered this quote, but it's another good example of an ellipsis in our scientific knowledge. Since I've by now literally spent more than a dozen years thinking about the problem of an absent science of civilization, the problem has prompted me to come at it from the other direction, so that I've thought about both science from the perspective of civilization and civilization from the perspective of science. This has opened up a philosophy of science to me in a distinctive way, since I came to it not to explore how philosophy grapples with the present state of the art and science, but rather I came to philosophy of science as someone asking, why has science not done such and such? And this has given me a distinctive outlook on the endeavor. I found myself forming my own philosophy of science from this reactionary perspective. And this is a philosophy of science that overlaps with a philosophy of history and a philosophy of civilization. The idea of a science of civilization suggests the counterfactual of what it would have been like if the lack of a science of civilization had been noticed earlier, and if someone had attempted, with at least moderate success, to found a scientific research program in civilization. There were a few men who almost made the breakthrough to a science of civilization. Henry Thomas Buckle would have been the kind of man who could have done this. He traveled, he studied, he understood the need for a scientific approach and for observing what he called comprehensive facts. And that's why, or one reason why, my episode on Buckle was almost an hour long. But Buckle's work wasn't taken up by others and elaborated in any systematic way. Partly this was because Buckle died young and didn't finish his work, partly because of the reaction against his work by traditionalist historians like Lord Acton, who believed moral judgment of the past to be the primary task of the historian, and partly from mere lack of interest. It takes a defining figure to define a discipline, and apparently Buckle was not that defining figure for a science of civilization. So what do I mean by a defining figure? Darwin, in writing The Origin of Species, defined the discipline of evolutionary biology that had not previously existed up to that time. And after that, nothing was the same again in biology after Darwin. And of course, there are other examples of definitive works. For example, Clausewitz's on war and Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. In the present context, I want to especially focus on Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, but I could just as well take Karl von Clausewitz as my example. Both Smith and Clausewitz represent the application of Enlightenment ideals of scientific knowledge to a particular domain of human experience and activity. For Smith, it was economics. For Clausewitz, it was war. Adam Smith published his The Wealth of Nations at the high water mark of the Enlightenment. The book was immediately influential and arguably has only grown in influence since that time. Smith's book effectively created the modern discipline of economics, much as Darwin's Origins effectively created scientific biology. There were many books on economics written before Adam Smith, as there were books about biology written before Darwin, but earlier economic treatises, like earlier biological treatises, didn't provide the conceptual framework adequate for the foundation of a discipline on scientific principles. I could say that the financial needs of the Industrial Revolution meant that someone would inevitably formulate a scientific economics, but we've already seen that this does not always happen, or it certainly doesn't happen automatically or inevitably. I could equally well claim that the biological needs of agricultural civilizations would have inevitably resulted in a scientific biology, but this manifestly didn't happen. We didn't get Darwin until we had had civilization for many thousands of years. But suppose that instead of Adam Smith initiating the development of scientific economics during the Enlightenment, or in addition to Adam Smith doing this, some other scientific discipline, specifically one not yet in existence today, had its origins during the Enlightenment. So this is my sense of a thought experiment that involves swapping an existing state of affairs with with a non-existent state of affairs, which you can do on an intuitive level by swapping one person for another. So suppose we swap Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations with a non-existent founder of a science of civilization and a definitive book that initiated the development of the scientific study of civilization. In this scenario, some author writes a definitive text on the science of civilization in the late 18th century or the early 19th century, more or less single-handedly formulating an adequate conceptual framework for the study of civilization and creating a social science with civilization as its special object of scientific investigation. This text then goes on to be the basis of an ongoing scholarly tradition, so that a science of civilization beginning in the Enlightenment grows into a formal academic discipline with entire departments of universities devoted to its study. I should note that the social sciences during the Enlightenment were far behind the development of the natural sciences, which latter began the scientific revolution, essentially. There was no parallel development of the social sciences, much less the development of a science of civilization, on the order of what was going on in physics, chemistry, biology, and geology at this time. However, this near total absence of an equally well-developed social science tradition didn't stop Adam Smith from initiating modern economics as a social science discipline. Perhaps economics was the first social science to assume a modern form, and it may be relevant that economics is the most formalized and mathematicized of the social sciences today. If we take history to be a social science, then history is certainly far older than economics, but history stagnated from modern classical antiquity until the modern period and didn't become the basis of a growing social science tradition in the way that economics became something of a template for the social sciences that would follow in the 19th and 20th centuries. We can even speculate on how a social science of civilization might have come about during the Enlightenment. There was a time in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, the late Enlightenment, when both Adam Smith and Kant were active, when an individual with sufficient resources could have traveled the world almost as extensively as today, albeit a bit more slowly. This was the same time when young English noblemen took the grand tour of Italy, traveling through Europe at a time when European societies were strikingly different from each other. This was also an age of gentlemen amateurs, some of whom became great scientists, as in the case of Charles Darwin. If we combine a wealthy young gentleman of leisure with opportunities for travel and the acceptance of gentlemen amateurs in the sciences, we can imagine the elements in place for a counterfactual, early modern science of civilization. So, with this imaginative picture in mind, I'm going to return to my favorite group of Enlightenment friends, whom I first introduced in my episode, Demography is Destiny, for a thought experiment about population trends in that episode. The painting I used then, and which I'm using again now to illustrate a group of Enlightenment-era friends, is British Gentlemen in Rome, painted about 1750 by the Scottish artist Catherine Reed. She's really caught the spirit of the times in this painting, I think. She studied for a while with Maurice Quentin de la Tour, who was one of the great Enlightenment portraitists. And if you look at her self-portrait, you'll see that she sports the same enigmatic Enlightenment smile seen in the other great portraits of the age. These Enlightenment portraits are so knowing and self-confident and so self-assured, I can't help but love the people in them, and I wish that I'd known them, to be honest. In any case, these British gentlemen in Rome were doing the grand tour. So what was the grand tour? Wealthy and aristocratic young Englishmen would travel to the continent to take in the sights and the culture almost as a kind of finishing school to complete their education. This was intended to be self-consciously to be a self-consciously improving exercise for young men of rank and wealth, even if it didn't actually turn out that way in all cases, or perhaps even in most cases. If you get the chance, I recommend that you watch the documentary Brian Sewell's Grand Tour of Italy, where he discusses this in some detail and also very humorously, I might add, and talking about the ways in which the Grand Tour was not necessarily self-improving and was more about indulgence, but still, for some it was. And we're focusing on the exception, the possibility of a man who catches the spirit of intellectual adventure and travel and then wants to delve in uh, to the idea of civilization once bitten by the bug, as it were. Given the resources to travel and a sufficiently robust constitution that would allow for a bit of discomfort, one would have at this time an historically unique opportunity to travel the world and to see profoundly different civilizations, little influenced by each other in comparison to the level of cross-cultural influence today. With this in mind, I could even construct an imaginary backstory for our counterfactual author of a counterfactual 18th century treatise on civilization, consisting of the social and cultural equivalent of Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, subsequently returning home to reflect upon his experiences. Alternatively, a sedentary scholar like Kant might seclude himself in his library with the great travelogues being written at about the same time. These travel narratives were being written at this time because travel became possible at this time on a planetary scale. I'm thinking of the likes of Carl Linnaeus, James Bruce, Richard Burton, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Charles M. Doughty. And there were many others, of course, some of whom traveled with a scientific purpose in mind, like Carl Linnaeus, and some of whom traveled for the sake of travel, for the enjoyment of travel. Our imaginary sedentary scholar might draw from these accounts and travel logs of nearly pristine civilizations the idea for a scientific account of civilization. Some world-traveling gentleman amateur would have had the opportunity to witness regional civilizations uncontaminated by all but immediate neighbors, piquing the curiosity of our traveler, much as Darwin's curiosity was piqued by his naturalist observations made during his time on the Beagle in its expedition around South America. Returning home to ruminate over all he has seen, he begins collecting more information about every known civilization and eventually sets pen to paper to record his collected observations and the principles employed to unify his observations. Traveling and reading would have made possible the study of civilization in an empirical, scientific manner by visiting regional civilizations, observing them, and perhaps even measuring them by whatever means might have been available to social science metrics of the time. This exercise might have involved creating new methods of measurements or new metrics, as Galileo created his own methods of quantitative research for physical phenomena. If a science of civilization had been formed early in the Enlightenment, there would have been no record of industrialization and only the record of the present for the Enlightenment itself. Such a position in history could well have given an impression of civilization in which industrialization and the Enlightenment played little or no part, and agriculture was believed to be the central necessity of any civilization. We find something like this in the physiocrats among the Enlightenment economists. One could then imagine civilization being subsequently transformed, and since a new civilization fails to embody that which was believed to be necessary to it, namely the centrality of agriculture, subsequent generations would understand themselves to be living in some kind of post-civilization, a new institution related to civilization through descent with modification, but not itself being civilization. Alternatively, we can equally well imagine the science of civilization already extant prior to or during the Industrial Revolution would then be an immediate spectator of the Industrial Revolution, receiving an enormous impetus to theorize the transformations then taking place in civilization. Under these conditions, a science of civilization, originally innocent of industrialization, might have become a more comprehensive and adequate science capable of theorizing macroscopic changes in civilization, leaving it ready for the next great transition, whatever that may be. How it played out would have a lot to do with the degree to which others became interested and involved. In some cases, a scientific research program catches on almost immediately. And as Darwin wrote in his autobiography, or one of a couple drafts of autobiographies he left unpublished on his death, quote, innumerable well-observed facts were stored in the minds of naturalists, ready to take their proper places as soon as any theory which would receive them was sufficiently explained, unquote. In other cases, a scientific research program catches on much more slowly, developing in fits and starts, as it were, or experiencing a long, slow, shallow growth curve in the beginning and only coming into full flower much later after an inflection in his growth curve. In a science of civilization emergent in the 19th century instead of the 18th century might have resulted in a science with what we could call a different temper. There's an excellent book by Richard Holmes that I recommend, The Age of Wonder, How the Romantic Generation Discovered the Beauty and Terror of Science. This book communicates the passion and the sense of adventure that Romantic era scientists brought to their work. And if a science of civilization had begun in this period, it would have been marked by this passionate sense of engagement. We tend to think of the 19th century conception of civilization as somewhat naive or even worse, but it was, for those who traveled, informed by direct observations of geographically regional civilizations. Geographically regional civilizations were in the 19th century much more isolated from each other than civilizations are today. The conceptions of civilization derived from these more pristine tokens of the type were, in a sense, a more sophisticated understanding based on first-hand knowledge. And these conceptions were formed before the resistance to comparing and contrasting civilizations appeared, which hampers progress today in understanding civilization. If you want to horrify a contemporary anthropologist or archaeologist, propose rank ordering all civilizations by an objective, quantifiable metric. In order to identify the common core of civilization, one must be willing and able to analyze civilizations. And analyzing civilizations would mean reducing them to their constituent parts and determining the relationship of the parts to the whole. To do this with civilization requires a certain social environment that does not obtain at the present time. Civilizations as we see them today have been racked on the Procrustean bed of universalism and can no longer be seen for what they are because of the strong ideological overlay of scholarship at present. If the rudiments of a science of civilization had been initially presented by a definitive text of the Enlightenment, or even of the Romantic era, and subsequently refined and formalized as economics and biology have been refined and formalized since their inception as modern scientific disciplines, how might the world have been different? Would the history of Western civilization have been altered by the self-understanding made possible by a science of civilization? A science of civilization could lead to technologies of civilization, just as biological science has led to biological technologies. With the science of civilization issuing in technologies of civilization, we would be in possession of the means to actively intervene in the process of civilization in order to attain certain ends. One could see in this ability both profound dangers and profound opportunities. Existential risks are always the flip side of existential opportunities. Even though there was this opportunity for the study of civilization when civilizations were largely isolated from each other, it didn't happen. And so, as I presented it here, this thought experiment will forever remain a counterfactual, unrealized in our history. We could still today begin the scientific study of civilization, but the evidence of isolated and pristine civilizations is being lost by the day, just as the archaeological and geological record are degraded by the passage of time and further human activity. The earlier a science appears in history, the more it can take advantage of an historical record before it's degraded by the passage of time. Ideally, a science of civilization would have originated very early in history, which suggests the happy idea of a science of civilization arising in ancient Greece at the same time geometry, astronomy, and history got their start. A science of civilization getting its start in classical antiquity would have passed through thousands of years of development like mathematics and have experienced several major revolutions in how it's practiced. But we didn't have anything like that with civilization. What we seem to have with the study of civilization is a sequence of rare excursions into a relatively neglected region of scholarship that connects books strung out across centuries, written by different individuals in different societies and in different languages. Such a tradition becomes aware of itself as a tradition only very slowly, with an almost painful incrementalism, if it ever becomes aware of itself at all as a distinctive scientific research program. We could count Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah as part of a tradition like this, mostly neglected, with only a competent and comprehending reader coming along once in a generation or two. As these rare readers will have ideas of their own, they're less likely to build upon earlier ideas. And so it is only every several hundred years that someone comes along to place another brick upon the edifice of a theory of civilization. It's possible that the painful incrementalism of a neglected tradition of scholarship may at some point experience an inflection point. Arguably, biology advanced little beyond Aristotle until Darwin. Mathematics advanced little beyond Euclid and Apollonius until Descartes. Physics advanced little between Archimedes and Galileo, and so on. Disciplines then can stagnate for hundreds, perhaps even for thousands of years. And arguably, this has happened with history. There was no historian in the Western tradition the equal of Thucydides until Gibbon. As much as I enjoy reading Froissart or Joinville, they never rise to the analytical achievement of Thucydides or Gibbon. It's an interesting question as to how this stagnation of history interacted with the possibility of a science of civilization that was never realized. If we pursue the idea of a science of civilization to before the Enlightenment, we can displace ourselves sufficiently in time that we come to Ibn Khaldun and the argument that Ibn Khaldun founded or attempted to found a science of civilization in the 14th century. Ibn Khaldun was read, but he wasn't read by enough people for a scientific research program to emerge from the tradition he initiated. It could be argued that by the time Ibn Khaldun wrote the Muqaddimah, the golden age of Islamic civilization was already at an end, and it wouldn't be realistic to suppose that a research community could come into being in the declining years of a once great civilization. It's certainly not impossible, but I don't think it's likely to happen. Although in saying that, I'm taking a position against Hegel and Spengler. Hegel famously said that the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the setting of the sun. That is to say, only when a culture or civilization enters into its end stages can there be understanding, the owl of Minerva or Athena in Greek terminology. And Spengler, of course, had a similar point of view. And he, by writing The Decline of the West, he was writing work. He felt that he was near the end of the Faustian era of Western civilization. Suppose we go back a little further in time to the 13th century and to Europe, and I mean a little further back from Ibn Khaldun. The 13th century was the efflorescence of medieval European civilization, when great retinues of liveried servants were the ornaments of every noble household, and great feasts and great tournaments were held, no less impressive to the common people than the bread and circuses of ancient Rome. This was before the medieval world was laid low by the Black Death, when populations, cities, and trade had recovered after the low point following the dissolution of Roman power in Western Europe. At this point, I can offer a parallel formulation of my earlier speculation that an Enlightenment era science of civilization might have been given a great impetus to growth by the Industrial Revolution. And analogously, a medieval science of civilization might have been given a great impetus by witnessing the Black Death and its aftermath. If the word civilization had been in use at this time, and we had asked one of the scholastic philosophers of the 13th century to define the meaning of civilization, what kind of definition would such a philosopher have put forward? While a careful student of Aquinas or Duns Scotus or Occam might be able to formulate a scholastic definition of civilization ex post facto, and to do so in the spirit of the time, we can be confident that this definition of civilization would differ substantially from our own definition of civilization, not least because it would derive from a different intellectual milieu and a distinct conceptual infrastructure. But we probably couldn't effectively engage in this thought experiment because we would be struggling, even if we were not aware of the struggle, to formulate a definition that was consistent with the whole of civilization as we know it today, which is a whole that includes medieval European civilization as a part, but also all that followed after that civilization. If a scholastic philosopher had attempted to define civilization, he would have attempted to define medieval European civilization. We could make a separate thought experiment of it to imagine how a medieval philosopher would have attempted to define industrialized civilization. This would be fraught with all the kinds of problems, and these are the kind of problems that are like my thought experiment in the Demography is Destiny episode, when I asked if it would be possible to explain to an 18th century gentleman the population spike of the 20th century. That is, can you explain something utterly unprecedented in history to someone who hasn't experienced it? And we can think of that a little bit retroactively for those who lived during the Black Death, which I suggested just a bit earlier, could have been a major impetus to a social science tradition in the medieval world. Within the space of a few years, people experienced a population collapse of 25, 30, 35%, worse in some places. So they witnessed this with their own eyes. They witnessed this enormous, unprecedented event. And now, hundreds of years later, can we understand that? Well, we can understand it theoretically. We can give you the numbers and estimates of how many people died, but we don't have the lived experience of that history. But that's another question for another episode. But in every episode, we need to deal with this problem of how do you explain something utterly outside the scope of someone's experience? It's worthwhile to recall that when the medievals portrayed the ancient world, they portrayed it in medieval terms, in medieval costume, and in medieval settings, which is what I think gives the art of the period its particular charm. Given this well-known proclivity of the medieval mind not to distinguish itself as a distinct age, different from classical antiquity, it's not likely that a scholastic philosopher would have made much of an effort to include different civilizations of the past within his definition, though a well-traveled scholastic like Raymond Hugues might have attempted also to include Islamic civilization. There are many definitions of civilization today, none of them entirely satisfying. But what all these definitions have in common is that they're all relatively recent. The most common definition of civilization employed today is a definition derived from V. Gordon Child's seminal paper on the urban revolution, in which he listed what he called 10 rather abstract criteria, as he called them, for identifying a civilization. So it's not a definition in a precisely logical sense, it's a list of properties. Many historians and archaeologists, since this paper was published have adopted, adapted, or revised Child's 10 criteria, and something like this list persists to this day. We can say then that something like a scientific research program developed around Child's urban revolution paper, and archaeologists have since produced many theories of the origins of civilization. This has been indeed one of the most productive areas of the study of civilization in the past century are the archaeologists and theories of the origins of civilization. In retrospect, we can see that Child's list isn't really intended to capture civilization in itself, but rather to try to capture the origins of civilization and what's typical of the earliest civilizations. So we could say this was an archaeologist's project. Child and his fellow archaeological travelers in prehistory achieved, after a fashion, a kind of retroactive thought experiment. They put themselves in the shoes of some ancient social scientist describing ancient civilizations in which they never lived. They tried to give an account of ancient civilization, but doing so retroactively. And this is different from attempting to do so in regard to the present or the future. We can attempt to grasp the nature of earlier civilizations, imaginatively taking away what we know to have happened since then, which is to say, imaginatively annihilating all subsequent history that led to the world that we inhabit today. But attempting to grasp the nature of future civilizations involved an effort in an imagination that is beyond most of us. In defining civilization today, we are primarily attempting to define a contemporary civilization. And if we're historically informed, we might want to make a gesture to including earlier civilizations within our definition. That is to say, we want to produce a definition of civilization that is sufficiently general that it would include our civilization today, the kind of civilization we have today, which implies a taxonomy of civilizations, and earlier civilizations and the kinds of civilizations that they were. But civilization is in a process of perpetual self-transcendence. I suspect that if a medieval scholastic philosopher produced a definition of civilization, this definition would be implicitly based on a roughly feudal structure of society, with religion playing a central role in civilization. The very idea of an industrial or a technological or scientific civilization could scarcely have been conceived during what James J. Walsh called the greatest of centuries. Somehow, though, the modern civilization that we know today emerged from the medieval civilization that contradicted almost everything that was in the modern civilization. And yet, continuity was still retained in that transition from medieval to modern civilization, enough so that we can recognize a distinctive lineage of Western civilization. And when civilization next transcends itself, as it transcended itself when it made the transition from medieval to modern civilization, when it transcends itself next and becomes something utterly different from what it has been to date, the previous history of civilization will be seen as a poor guide to understand the new social institutions that emerge in the wake of this self-transcendence. And if and when the next great macro-scale disruption occurs in civilization, and I say disruption here because it can be a transcendence event like the Industrial Revolution, but it can also be a disruptive event like the Black Death. But if and when the next great disruption occurs, and if there is by that time a science of civilization, then that science of civilization will be an eyewitness to unprecedented events that could serve as the inflection point in the development of such a science. So thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode.